afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you here for a discussion on a very important topic, in fact, three important topics. Before I introduce the topics and the speakers briefly, I want to particularly say that one of our guests, Michael Weiss, is here as a result of the US Embassy, and he and Peter Kreco of Political Capital, one of our think tank rivals in the city, with which we have obviously a friendly relationship as well as a rivalrous one. I'd like to thank them for making this occasion possible too. Now, our topic today is a sadly topical one. Namely, we are asking, as so often, my apologies to the embassy here, what the hell does the US think it's doing in three crisis areas? The three crisis areas are Central Asia, the Middle East, and Ukraine. And the title is a little more polite than I pretended. We are actually asking the question, what does the US have discernible goals in those three areas? I'll venture to suggest that in one area at least, Washington does have a discernible goal, or did. The area is Ukraine. And until recently, it looked as if the US wanted to assist and secure a Ukrainian victory over the Russian invasion. That, at least, was the apparent goal. Today, that's not quite so clear as before, not only because the president occasionally misspeaks, and the White House has to clean up his remarks, but also because there are obviously different perspectives on Ukraine policy, both within Europe, where the differences can be glaring at times, particularly in relation to German policy, and within Washington. And therefore, uncertainty is beginning to grow on this central topic. In the Middle East, uncertainty also encompasses American policy in regard to one of its own recent successes, or rather the success of the late Trump administration, namely the Abraham Accords, which seem to embarrass Washington as much as provide it with a different way forward. Is Washington now learning to digest this embarrassing success, or if so, how? And finally, Central Asia, which last year saw the unforced humiliation of the US withdrawal. Are there now signs of recovery from that setback? Well, I'm delighted that these questions will be answered not by me, but by three distinguished speakers. Michael Weiss, we're very glad to welcome you to Budapest, Michael. You have written very importantly on the question of terrorism, and particularly with your book on ISIS, but you also keep your hand in Russia policy, so to speak, with a close relationship with the Russia House in Washington. And finally, you are very active in political journalism, both with the Daily Beast, where you're a senior editor, but also with CNN and on television. So welcome to Budapest. I hope you enjoy your visit. Our two local speakers are distinguished friends of the Institute, as well as being involved in these questions on their own. Márton Ugrósdy is head of the Institute of Trade and Foreign Policy and a very senior analyst in this city, in this country. And Viktor Eszterhai is similarly an expert in these areas. We're delighted to have you both here. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Anton Bendarzsevszkij, the head of our Department of Research, and he will take over and introduce the speakers again, and I will retreat respectfully to the audience. Andrew.
Thank you very much, John, for the introduction. Well, I would like to ask our speakers to come, and well, we will start the panel. I don't know if you need any more introduction after this marvelous words from John. Maybe on your areas of expertise. Viktor is covering mostly Asia, Eastern Asia, and China. So I think I may say that he's one of the best experts on China in Hungary. Márton is covering mostly United States and global security issues. And actually, both Viktor and Márton were my colleagues previously in some other professional career. And well, Michael, you were dealing with the Middle East and ISIS before, and now your main topic of research, as far as I know, is Russia, Russian disinformation, and you're also writing a book on Russian military intelligence service, right? The GRU. Just a quick question before we start. How's the book? How the book going? When we will be able to read it?
It's about halfway written, but my publisher very kindly. Oh, sorry. It's about halfway done. About 3 months ago, my publisher very kindly preempted a phone conversation I was going to have with him and said, "Listen, take another year, wait till the war is done, add 3 or 4 more chapters to it." So it should be out sometime next year. Yeah, but it's a history going back to essentially the beginning, 1918 until the present day.
It's also based on some secret materials which you got from some source.
And the GRU has become an increasingly leaky ship as of late, so I'm hoping to get even more materials in due course, but yeah.
Thank you very much. But now we will talk mostly about U.S. Foreign policy in Middle East, Central Asia, and Russia. We'll start with the East going towards the West. And I have some questions. It will take maybe 40 to 50 minutes, and then I'll open the floor for the public for a Q&A session, so you'll be able to ask your questions as well. But maybe my first question will go to China, not even the Central Asia, but because we have Viktor here as well, so I think it's an important question. And please answer true or false, and then maybe you can also tell more about it. Is China the #1 contender of United States right now at this very moment? And also connected to this, was the U.S. policy towards China right or wrong in the last years? Maybe we could talk about the last 10 years, where we had also the administration of Barack Obama, administration of Donald Trump, and now we have the administration of Joe Biden.
So if I can start, yeah, I would agree that the biggest challenge of the United States is China now, but a bigger framework would be more correct if you would say the axis between China and Russia is the biggest threat for the United States. So in the last decade, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, it became obvious, I think in Washington, that China is in some respect really challenging the capacity regarding economics of the United States. And the obvious answer for this was the so-called pivot to Asia, to strengthen alliance system, focusing more on security, and to somehow slowly try to stop the further rise of China. But after Crimea, Russia also come into the picture. And from a point of view, it added another challenge for the United States, that this is not just a competitor as we have with China in terms of economy, but also from a military aspect as well. This alliance is creating a challenge now. So what I see is that the major circumstances here we have to understand is that this hegemonic position of the United States, which was based on capacity and the acceptance of other actors globally, has been challenged by China and the Russian cooperation and many other emerging poles, the European Union, Japan, and some other previous alliances, which used to belong to the alliance system of the United States, starting to flirt with this new reality that there is a challenging axis of the United States. So in Europe, the European Union, for example, several countries were arguing that, okay, of course, we have a traditional economic partner, the United States, but from another point of view, we have to also deepen our cooperation with China and also with Russia, because that's our economic interest. And from this point of view, the biggest question is what could be the answers from Washington. There was a big talk before the Biden administration that there will be a strategy which will be clear for all the actors that what we should act and how should we act together. I think that's still not a coherent strategy. One thing is sure that the alliance with the United States and other actors should be strengthened, so we have to act together. And there is a new identity or I would say identity element of the picture as well, that there will be a huge confrontation between the authoritarian regimes and also the free democracies. But still a big question that what are the sticks and carrots of the United States in this case? What are the red lines for the other countries? And whether it is realistic to see the international relations so black and white. So also giving to this Chinese point of view into this discussion, that's the biggest question for the longer term, that in this interconnected world where so many actors have interest with having economic relations with China, Russia, and also some cases military relationship, can this kind of strategy be fit to our interest? And of course I can talk about this for weeks, but
thank you. Let's move to Michael, if you can tell your point of view.
Well, I can give you sort of the American perspective, particularly with regard to this administration, because I did some reporting during the transition about, well, what is going to be the big geostrategic policy of the Biden administration. Michael Carpenter, who was the president of the Penn Biden Center and had written with Joe Biden several op-eds, very much a Russia hawk, certainly shares my point of view on the threat of Putin, not just in the region, but on the world stage. And he had told me on the record, absolutely, positively no reset. And it made sense that, the Democrats in certainly the 4 years of the Trump administration kept banging on about the Russian interference campaign in 2016. Democratic political operatives and pundits and commentators on cable news, I mean, they all sounded like Whittaker Chambers about the threat of, Russian interference and espionage and so on. And my concern going into this new period or this transition was going to be that, the Russia bugbear, as it were, was being instrumentalized for party political purposes, and it will be a reversion to the status quo ante. And you began to see in the early days of this administration a kind of reset in all but name. There was the meeting in Geneva with Putin, between Biden and Putin, talks of cybersecurity cooperation, which I recall being roundly mocked by the left when I think Donald Trump just tweeted something to that effect. Things that seem to suggest a creeping rapprochement, or at least the way this administration would couch it, stable and normal relations, or stable and predictable relations. And indeed, within the White House and the policy planning and national security apparatus, there was a split view. The president and Anthony Blinken, I'm given to believe, still understood the threat posed by Putin and still knew that Russia was going to be more than a nuisance. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, John Feiner were of the view that no, we need to focus on the next 25 years of American geostrategic thinking. China, the rise of China as a commercial competitor, military competitor, to some extent even now a soft power competitor. This is what we need to deal with, and we just need to put Russia back in its box. Every administration comes to office thinking that they can have some kind of reboot or reset or accommodation struck with the Kremlin, regardless of what has transpired in the previous administration. And every administration finds that it is sorely disappointed because there is a stable and reliable relationship with Russia. Russia very reliably undermines American stability, European stability, and threatens NATO and certainly what it would consider to be its near abroad. So now I think we're in a sort of fulcrum moment where, this president, by dint of his having come of age politically during the Cold War, he is fundamentally a transatlanticist. Europe whole and free meant something to him. He believes in that conviction. And even though there has been a sort of grand recession of American, certainly hard power from the Middle East, a conflict just broadly he doesn't think America has any stake in and should not commit any more resources and blood and treasure to. With respect to Europe, I mean, he genuinely believes in defending Ukraine. The question now is, the longer this war goes on, the more sanctions begin to have a deleterious effect on certainly the American economy, and frankly also his domestic approval rating. This is a president who's embattled. It looks to me that the midterm elections coming up are going to be a Republican wash, and he is polling lower than Donald Trump was at the same point in his presidency. Now, I have my criticisms and my complaints about U.S. policy with respect to Ukraine, including security assistance. But, and here I speak just as somebody who regularly talks to the Ukrainians after this event, tonight I'm taking the train to Ukraine and then to Kyiv, so I plan to have even more conversations. Several months ago, I was given their shopping list of weapon systems. Many of the items on that list look quite fanciful, and when I would run it by military experts, security analysts, they'd say, oh, well, here are all the reasons why they can't have this. All of a sudden, there's maybe one or two items on that list that they haven't got. I don't mean pledged, I mean haven't got. HIMARS, multiple launch rocket systems, these kinds of things. Now, the question is, in what number, and will there be sufficient enough to face down the Russian onslaught, particularly in Donbass? This remains to be seen. But so far, I've been pleasantly impressed and surprised by the level of commitment of this administration into counteracting Russian aggression. And look, they got the likelihood stroke inevitability of the war correct. The intelligence, though, on how the war was going to go was catastrophically wrong. Kyiv was meant to fall in 72 hours. It didn't. But I have to say, and I'm proud to say, the U.S. played an integral role in ensuring that that didn't happen. The intelligence sharing in particular, alerting the Ukrainians as to where their air defenses needed to be moved, where the Russians were coming in, and we still don't have the full scope of what was done. This is all to the greater good. And look, this has revivified NATO. To a certain extent, it has served as a kind of house cleaning in Europe with respect to Russian influence, state capture of the elites, energy dependency. Now, I have plenty of complaints about the way Germany and France continue to behave, but we're having this debate in earnest now. It's a shame that it took a genocide to precipitate this, but I suppose that's the way history has to work sometimes. So my concern is, can we keep the focus on this conflict in a meaningful capacity, and will we begin to have our own sort of war of attrition in terms of attention span, emotional investment, and strategic consideration about the threat that Russia will continue to impose. So 2 comments just briefly before I hand it over. Were quite controversial in the American context, and I thought, if anything, were very commonsensical and moral. One was made by President Biden in Warsaw. This is one of his famous off-the-cuff, wandering cognitive remarks, but I thought, good on him, which is that this man cannot remain in power, referring to Vladimir Putin. This was interpreted in certain precincts in the American political discourse as a call for regime change. It wasn't that. It was a very sort of just honest appraisal of the threat he continues to pose. And the other was recently made by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, which is that the American goal, the policy, is to degrade the Russian military capability so that it cannot wage a war of conquest like this, certainly not in the short to midterm. We can have a discussion and a debate about how much of a commitment needs to be made in terms of territory that Ukraine must take back, diplomatic overtures, floated peace settlements either by the Italians or whatnot. But so far, the Ukrainians seem to be much less enervated than they had been weeks and months ago, and I would have liked this stuff to have been delivered in advance of the war. But I also don't agree with the idea that it's too little, too late, and Ukrainians don't believe that either.
Thank you. Márton, would you like to comment on US and China?
Okay, you said that we should move from east to west, so I'll try to focus on China, and then I guess there will be questions on Ukraine as well, yes, so I'll reserve my comments.
We'll move on later.
I think it was very clear from the beginning that the US does treat China as the main economic rival, at least. Whether China is an ideological rival to the US is a good question, because China does not really have that kind of ideological expansionism that the Soviet Union had with the World Revolution. So China, in my opinion at least, never wanted to change the political systems of other countries as long as they could ensure and enforce their interests on them through loans, different financial schemes, investments, Belt and Road. It wasn't that important as long as there was some kind of tangible control over these governments, and it worked very well in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and other places. And I think what the US started to do vis-a-vis China did make a lot of sense. because the Obama administration started to recognize this threat, started to reposition military supplies to the Pacific theater, tried to outsource Europe and the Middle East to Europe, which didn't really work, because if you look at how effective Europe has been in managing armed conflicts in the last 30 years, we always screwed up and had to ask the Americans for help. Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, not Afghanistan, but Libya, and Crimea later on. So despite all the talks about strategic autonomy, increased military cooperation within the European Union, I mean, our missile stocks wouldn't last for 2 days. I mean, you don't have hard power if you run out of missiles in 2 days, which happened in Libya about 10 years ago. Later on, when the Trump administration came to power, it was really interesting that they also stepped down on the economic front with the trade war that was initiated. So, you know, from the Republican hawkish point of view, if you want to take on China, you have to deal with their economy. You have to destroy that kind of an economic cooperation and coexistence that exists between two countries. Whether this is good or bad is a good question. We can debate that. But if you want to take on the Chinese, you have to take care of the economic base, and that was just the Trump administration did. And if you look at the trade volumes, of course it went down significantly after the first couple of years, and then of course it started to come back once this tougher stance was reviewed later in the later stages of the Trump administration, especially after President Biden took office. Now, and I think Viktor is much well versed in this than I am, but I do think that China might not be so interested in what the United States is doing. They're playing their own game, and they're playing it in the long run. So if you look at the development of the PLA Navy, for example, they have their program for the next 50 years, building carriers, undersea capabilities, A2AD capacities to take on Taiwan at a future point of time. So in that sense, the Chinese are not so much concerned about, you know, what kinds of weapon systems the Americans are deploying, what are their strategy, and so on and so forth. And I think this is a major advantage on the Chinese side, because they don't have elections every second year, whereas the United States has. So in that sense, that kind of political stability that you need to build up a very tangible great power status is there on the Chinese side. And because of our systemic design of the political system that we have in the West, we are unable to conquer that or counter that, because our politicians have to go to the polls from time to time, and there is discontinuity in government. I think this is good that we have elections from time to time, so don't get me wrong. I'm absolutely for elections, but when it comes to great power rivalry, it makes our task a lot more complicated than for the Chinese leadership. So if I would be Trump, I would do the same. I would have some kind of a trade war, challenge China militarily, so they would have to spend more on arms, and they would have to take that money out from investment and domestic consumption and all these kind of things. I think where we have a bit of a miscalculation on the American side is that how the economies of the others, the challengers, work. This is very visible in the case how the West is handling the Russia sanctions. I mean, I might be able to talk about it. We're just putting together a paper on the effects of the sanctions. So Viktor, dig up some numbers. We're paying twice the amount of money for Russian oil today than we used to in January, after the sanctions were introduced. So, you know, in that sense, it's a bit strange that we're propping up the Russian state budget by promising to buy less oil in the future, by trying to diversify away from the Russian economy. But if you look at the bank accounts, I mean, look at those companies who have set up ruble bank accounts with Gazprom Bank recently. They include the biggest European gas distributors. And I'm not talking about Hungary, I'm talking about the Netherlands, not the Netherlands, but Germany, Italy, and many others who cannot afford to shut off Russian gas from today from tomorrow. And I think how the European Commission has handled this, that when they came out with their legal point of view that, you know, it might be possible to get around the sanctions and paying the Russians in rubles. I mean, that's not a legal position. I mean, if anybody would like to take that to court, that would be a really hard case to defend. That, you know, you are not allowed to pay with the scheme that the Russians have invented to allow for the payment of Russian gas. So, in that sense, I think there is a bit of a disconnect between what we speak and what we do. And obviously, what we do has a lot to do with reality. So don't get me wrong. I do not think it's feasible to shut off Russian gas supplies as we speak completely, because, you know, the European economy would stop and I would happily come back to that, whether this is good or bad for the United States if the European economy collapses, because that's also an interesting question. But the main point here is that I think the US is a bit controversial when it comes to communication and actual deeds. And that also holds true a little bit to what you have been mentioning about the arms deliveries, that, you know, the Ukrainians came up with an extensive shopping list. I also seen that a couple of months ago, very impressive. Is that, no, they're not going to have heavy equipment and tanks and all that kind of stuff. And what we're talking about right now is that the Czech Republic is swapping its T-72s for Leopard 2s. I mean, that's a great business, by the way, not for the Germans, but for the Czechs. So in that sense, it makes a lot of sense to get rid of Soviet legacy equipment. Whether it's good for the German economy is, of course, another question.
Well, thank you. We made a big leap from China, US to disinformation, Russia, war in Ukraine. But still, I would like to go back now to Central Asia. And again, a question like true and false. Do you think that the failure of United States in Afghanistan made Russia think more aggressively in a way, and maybe to not force them, but made them think that United States is weak and they can do whatever they want in their own region of interest? Was that some kind of an impulse for Russia? Who would like to start it?
So, as I mentioned, if we go back to this geopolitical framework, China plus Russia together is able to challenge the position of the United States in terms of economy and in terms of military security and so on. So in this regard, the answer is yes. So previously only the United States has the capacity, have the authority to launch a military war. But now this is seen from Beijing and also from Moscow that this world has already changed. We are equal with the United States together because we cannot be stopped. And in this case, yes, we have the right to I mean, from a legal point of view, none of the countries have the right to launch a war. But from geopolitical realities, that we have the capacity now to launch a war and nobody can stop us. So yeah.
At least they thought so.
At least they thought so. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally credit the reporting and the commentary that suggests Putin's war cabinet, including Nikolai Patrushev, are of a kind of Spenglerian belief that the West is terminally ill, that it is dying. And American power is in sharp decline, not just Afghanistan. And keep in mind, you know, Russia's intervention in Syria, which they had couched in the terms of its disinformation as a counterterrorism campaign targeting ISIS, selling it to the United States, or at least the electorate, as a kind of World War II style alliance between America and Russia to fight the new fascism of the world, was in fact a campaign to prop up Bashar al-Assad's regime, but more to the point, to target Western CIA-backed rebel groups in the Levant. So this had a twofold effect, I think. One, they saw it as retaliation for what we did to them in Afghanistan in 1979 onward. And number two, they realized that America does have a breaking point, and there was a capitulation. Barack Obama's now notorious red line on chemical weapons use, rather than retaliate militarily, he cut a deal with Putin, and it didn't actually lead to the complete removal of Syrian chemical weapons, and they simply pivoted to using chlorine gas instead of sarin gas in most instances. All of these things in aggregation, and yes, of course, the ignominious withdrawal from Kabul, and I mean, the administration tried to spin this mightily, that this was the most successful and bold airlift in history, but anybody watching their television screens will have seen just how cack-handed and mismanaged and terrible it was. All of these things have an aggregate effect of convincing, especially those who are already kind of predisposed to being ideologized about a coming confrontation with the West, to thinking, now is the time, they're on their knees, we should strike. Now, I don't know, I'm not extrapolating from that was the sole or even primary motivation for Putin to wage this war in Ukraine. He might have done it anyway or thought he could do it, but it certainly will have been a data point in his calculation, for sure.
Thank you. Márton?
I think it was an encouraging sign how the Americans and NATO has managed the withdrawal from Afghanistan and how disorganized that was. And it was also on air live on CNN I don't think the Russians would never have done that in 1989 when they pulled out of Afghanistan. So in that sense, there might have been a sense of weakness from the West. Now, if we make a direct causal connection with the decision to launch an attack on Ukraine from the Russian side, I have doubts whether that's a feasible and a credible explanation. Now, all the documents and all the commentary we're seeing on the war in Ukraine, that this has been in the making since at least 2014, since Crimea. So this was not, that Vladimir Putin woke up one morning that, okay, I'm going to attack Ukraine because I feel like it. He's been preparing his economy for that for decades. He's been preparing the Russian military, not so proficiently as we see, for that as well. They've been testing some of their tactics in the South Caucasus last year, especially with drone technology that we've been seeing also in the Ukrainian theater. So in that sense, this has been long in the making. Now, why implementation is so screwed up, sorry for saying that, is another question, which has a lot to do with the Russian strategic and military culture. But I think the feeling that it might be possible at this time was clearly there. And what undermines my reasoning a little bit is that officially NATO is not a party to this conflict. It's the Ukrainians fighting the Russians, using Western technology, military transfers, and so on and so forth. But Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO SecGen, is always saying that no matter what happens, NATO is not going to be part of this conflict. It's up to the individual member states to support Ukraine any means they see fit by providing money, humanitarian aid, fuel, weapons, ammunition, whatever. But NATO does not really have an official position on the fact that we must help Ukraine. There's no NATO resolution which calls for that. Of course, there's a very common understanding among the member states that this is necessary for certain geopolitical reasons. How long this is sustainable is a good question, especially as we're seeing the signs of a coming economic crisis of our own making, ironically, especially before the midterm elections with petrol being $7 a gallon in the US and even higher in Europe. So what kind of long-term economic and social and political consequences those issues will have is a completely different question, and we cannot really anticipate that yet. We do not know, for example, that what's going to happen to Germany and the German coalition government if they will figure out in November that Germany is not able to produce all the electricity and heating that is needed to get the country through the winter. And they will say that, yeah, we have stopped all these nuclear power plants in the last couple of years. What if we brought them back online? Now, that would obviously get the Green Party out of the coalition right away, which has been very anti-nuclear ever since allegedly the KGB has founded them back in the 1970s. Obviously, this is a joke. But, that would bring the German coalition government to its knees because it's such a fundamental question for the Green Party. And Macron, as at least is through the presidential election, he will still have the National Assembly elections coming up, I think, next week or something like that. So France might be an easier case. But if you look at all the coalition governments across Europe, and there's quite a few of them, and whether they can keep it together with so many economic and social constraints and issues coming to the surface because the lack of economic growth, because of the lack of energy, because of the disappearance of jobs, which will follow that, is a question that I think nobody has really thought about when we started to sanction the Russian economy. And I do think that if we will look at the whole conflict in the long term, that might be more detrimental to us than what we have achieved so far in economic sanctions and feeling good about employing economic sanctions against Russia.
Thank you. Be careful because your quotes may be taken without the part of the joke, and then you may find yourself in trouble.
I'm used to that.
Okay. I have a couple of questions on the Middle East, but maybe I'll jump it over because the time is going, and we can go on to Russia and Ukraine. Michael, you described Russia as a terrorist state back in 2016.
That's not true.
No?
I quoted the then Lithuanian president who called it a terrorist state, but that you got off Wikipedia. So what they did was they took the headline of the piece, which I did not write, speaking of being taken out of context or misquoted. But no, today I say this, I shouldn't even clear my throat because back then I might have had a few hiccups in being so forthright in print, but today I don't think I would be. I would consider it a terrorist state. The GRU, about which I'm writing a book, has in the last 8 or 9 years gone around blowing up ammunition depots and weapons manufacturing plants in the Czech Republic, in Bulgaria. They had tried to Novichok a defector in place, Sergei Skripal, unleashing WMD in a European cathedral city in the UK. They tried to Novichok Emilian Gebrev, Bulgarian arms dealer, his son, his factory manager. These are acts of terror conducted on EU, NATO territory, or in the case of the UK, I guess now former EU territory. And there have been very few repercussions apart from the PNGing of Russian intelligence officers and I guess some sanctions. This was all, by the way, every case but Skripal, although I have my hypothesis as to why the decision was taken to try and poison him at that time. The Vibrica bombing and the Bulgarian incidents were all related to arms shipments destined for, guess where? Ukraine. 152 millimeter artillery shells, which are in scarce supply in Europe, as the United States is now finding out in its security assistance package, were being basically stored in the Czech Republic and manufactured, refurbished by Gebrev's company, EMCO. So you have seen the level of commitment, going back to your earlier point, that this has been long in the making. Putin's obsession, his fixation with Ukraine, has been unshaken for at least a decade. I think I've actually interrupted your question because but I'm giving you sort of why I would now justify calling it.
At that time, you didn't mean that, or at least you were
Well, no, it's not that I didn't mean it. I was just a little. I mean, look, I am of the belief, and I have yet to meet a retiree of the American intelligence community who does not think that the 1999 Moscow apartment bombings was an FSB false flag attack. David Satter, who is a very good journalist, a center-right journalist, by the way, was the first American to be kicked out of Russia since the fall of the Berlin Wall for reporting on this.
He's a good friend of Danube Institute.
He is. John Dunlop at Stanford University Hoover Institution has written quite powerfully on this subject. I know it's still treated in certain quarters of the American media landscape as a conspiracy theory, although you'll notice that after Ukraine and after the Biden administration leaked preemptively the casus belli, or one of several of them that Putin was about to use as his justification for going into Ukraine, including false flag terror attacks in Donbass committed by quote-unquote separatists, suddenly the zeitgeist has shifted. And now, because we have seen what Putin is capable of in Europe, we begin to re-examine our assumptions of what he might have been capable of in 1999 in Russia. But consider, if this man's rise to power and the pretext for launching the Second Chechen War was built atop a mass grave of Russian civilians, I mean, apartment buildings in the capital, what does that say about his capacity for harm and evil on the world stage? So yes, I absolutely believe it's a terrorist state, at least under this regime.
So that's the question for all of you. Why do we keep coming back to Russia to try to cut a deal with it? There was if we go back, if we check only the last 10 years, there was a policy of Barack Obama, reset. It was 2009, right, or 2010. So right after the Russian-Georgian war. So there was a war in Georgia, and kind of a peace was cut with Russia, which apparently failed. Then we had the Minsk agreements with Russia. Nobody took care of the occupation of Crimea. I mean, nobody acknowledged it on a proper level. We won't dispute now about German policy towards Russia as well, but everything was designed towards cutting some kind of a peace deal with Russia. And now it's also, I think, the main thinking within the West is that or maybe that's not the main thinking, but still it prevails that we need to get back to business as usual and try to work with Russia as it was before. But apparently it's not working. It's not possible. So maybe you could comment on that.
I think there are at least two reasons for this. First of all of the American presidents believe that they understand what's going on in Russia. We've seen it in the Clinton-Yeltsin relationship. We've seen it when George W. Bush looked Vladimir Putin in the eye and he has seen his soul. We've seen it in reset. We've seen it in the Trump-Putin summits, and also with this unspoken of reset before the war in Ukraine. I think apart from the personal reasons, there must be some kind of a deep understanding, but Michael can falsify me on that, within the Beltway, that the number one threat is China, so you have to separate Russia from China. Because if you do that, China will be deprived of lots of natural resources that they need for their economy, their military development, access to territory, high technology, especially in the field of armament. So it makes a lot of sense to drive a wedge between China and Russia. Now, whether US behavior is conducive of achieving that is another question. And I think if the US strategic planners would really think about China as a long-term threat, which I think they do, they would be focusing a bit more on China proper and a bit less on Russia, which is, at the end of the day, declining power. It might be it may be declining a bit quicker as it is bleeding out resources and personnel in the war in Ukraine. Obviously, this is something that Russia cannot really sustain for the long run. And by the long run, I mean several years and not the upcoming 6 months, because it seems very obvious that Russia will be able to maintain the current level of pressure, at least for the foreseeable short-term future on Ukraine, unfortunately. So in that sense, I think it's really hard to understand that why Russia is such a central issue in American strategic thinking. And my only answer to that, but I would be happy to listen to your opinion as well, that the U.S. foreign policy establishment has been trained for more than 40 years to focus on the red threat of the Soviet Union. It's convenient, it's easy, it's the devil they know. So in that sense, it's easier to take on Russia, which they think they know, obviously they don't, but they think, and engage them as a less potential adversary apart from nuclear weapons, than taking on China, which might be on par in certain capacities, in certain military equipment, and which is overseas in a sense that any military confrontation with China would eventually start off as a maritime issue, where the Americans also have a lot to lose with the carrier strike groups and so on and so forth. Dealing with Russia is easier because you can have the Europeans fight them first. And you provide equipment to the Europeans, Ukrainians in this instance, and you don't have to sacrifice American lives to achieve that. But if there would be a direct confrontation between China and the US, it would be unavoidable that the US would be suffering a high level of human losses as well. And as we know pretty well from the last 50 years, that is something that the US public opinion cannot tolerate in the long run.
Michael?
Well, I quite agree that there's an American national pastime is a fundamental misapprehension of Russia, the nature of a regime, particularly this one, which is ruled by and large by former KGB or GRU officers, and the Chekist mentality in general. Also, the Russians have been quite good at influence peddling, creating these sort of narratives that seemingly, through some form of osmosis, wind up into the American foreign policy bloodstream. For instance, that this whole war is the fault of NATO expansion, in not just the 1990s, but the aughts. And you have now what I would call, one of the things that has been beneficial about this crisis is that Ukraine has managed, by surviving and by dint of being on this sort of fault line, to undercut or debunk so many myths, so many pieces of disinformation that have been disseminated for decades, including the idea that NATO is to blame for this. Sweden and Finland apply for NATO membership. Vladimir Putin shrugged. In fact, went on record to say, we don't have any security problems if Finland joins NATO. So in other words, you're worried about NATO tanks parked at your border, your periphery under American hegemony, and you've just now said that it's no big deal that 850 miles of your border is going to be NATO territory. This is extraordinary. Within a matter of 72 hours, a lifetime of work by John Mearsheimer was undone by the president of Russia. Other myths, that, for instance, the modernization and reform efforts that Putin had poured, particularly Shoigu, into the Russian military, were going to result in incredible dividends on the battlefield. The military analytical community in Washington, D.C., abetted by the intelligence assessments, again, just could not have been more wrong about this. And I see now a feverish attempt to try and spin and rationalize their failure of imagination and to appreciate that, if Russia can't defeat Ukraine, how is it ever going to take on NATO in any meaningful capacity? Yeah. In terms of, the evolving nature of, I guess, American thinking with respect to Russia. Look, one of the problems I think we've had is that the Cold War was a long time ago. I would argue it never really ended, never properly ended. I believe Edward Lucas's thesis on this to be 100% correct, but the conventional wisdom has it that Cold War is over, and this term, the Cold War mentality, was seen as a pejorative. Barack Obama used it, the Russians have used it. The idea that we can, under this new international liberal order, resort to a transactional relationship with Russia, and it'll be no big deal. There's not going to be dramatic security considerations or threats. I mean, again, how fanciful does this look in the rearview mirror now? I've been called every name in the book, a Russophobe, a neocon, warmonger, and all of this. And to my mind, look, if you just study the history of this country, particularly the Soviet period, and particularly the intelligence, the security apparatuses, and then again, look at who is in charge, who's in the cockpit in the Kremlin, very little has changed in terms of their strategic outlook. The ideology may have washed away or may have changed, in that there's not this messianic Marxist-Leninist doctrine, but the West as, the final confrontation, the West as the enemy against which we can measure our own success, our own sense of self-worth and dignity, the West which in the post-Cold War, the post-Soviet period, was seen as rapacious and predatory and looking to hobble Russia, bring it to its knees. Putin has created this myth. I mean, Russian state media really does not talk about a war against Ukrainians. It's a war against NATO. It's a war against the United States. And this has been bought hook, line, and sinker. I mean, I remember in 2014, there were Russians on the street being interviewed by what was then still a fairly independent or neutral press, who legitimately thought that American soldiers had invaded Russia. And that's why there was this state of emergency or this state of confrontation. So, look, again, it comes down to, will things change with this regime in power? Unfortunately, I don't see that happening unless through the intervention of nature. I mean, there are lots of rumors and allegations that Putin is very unwell physically, perhaps mortally so. I mean, I've reported on some of this and tried to interrogate how much of this is a psychological operation being wielded not just by Western actors, but also by Russian elites who feel completely let down. I have an oligarch on tape saying that he has single-handedly undone 30 years of what we've built up for him or for the country. And, it remains to be seen what's going to happen. I make no predictions, but I think what I hope is that this lesson will have been learned for at least a generation. I mean, because the Ukrainians certainly aren't going to forget this. This country is lost to Russia, which is one of the reasons I would advocate for them to join the European community and to be granted candidacy is a much bigger deal for them than joining NATO. I mean, they have single-handedly done what NATO was meant to do collectively, so they don't need that umbrella.
I have to say that I do not agree with Michael's statement that Russia can be identified as a terrorist state, because my explanation is that Russia...
It was a quote. No.
Yeah, quote, but yeah, we discussed it. That there are several examples he listed that which can be identified as a terrorist act. My opinion is that Russia is a state, is an extremely functioning state with functioning state organs, with substates as well, and this gives the capacity, the cognitive capacity, and whatsoever other capacities to identify the goals of Russia, identify who are they, what do they have to achieve to reach these goals, and therefore they will be able to deliver a strategy. And what you listed as an act, as a terrorist act, can we also see as elements of a tool or tools to achieve that strategy. And in this regard, they identify West as a danger for their own positions, their own goals. So therefore, these are very rational. These are very rational acts. I don't see it just simply as a terrorist acts. And from this point of view, this is also an important question.
From our perspective, it's they may be terrorist acts, but
Yeah,
from their state policy, they might be.
But this is a state identified it as an effective tool to achieve a kind of goal which is needed. So, and in this regard, if we ask this question, that can we cooperate with Russia, or what can we do with China? What could be the future between the West and Russia? If this is a terrorist state, we don't have to do anything with Russia. We can. I mean, the history of the West shows very well that we are not able to achieve anything with tribes, with sub-agents of states, and even terrorist gangs. But states can cooperate. States can discuss the issues. States can create order. So that my opinion is that probably this kind of view of Russia is misleading. But
well, if I may, I mean, there are terrorist organizations. I've written about them. I've met ISIS operatives who would consider their acts to be rational and in pursuit of their own interests. I don't think that's a clear criterion. And look, there's a difference between acts of state terrorism and acts committed by non-state actors that are defined as terrorist organizations. Legalistic distinctions, policy distinctions, and all of that. By the way, by using this term, which I'm not using lightly, doesn't foreclose on engaging with Russia. It doesn't foreclose on having diplomatic relations or even commercial and economic relations, which are still, very much, you alluded to how much we're still paying them. It's just, I mean, we have to be clear. If a state intelligence service sends covert operatives into foreign territories that are not in an active state of war with Russia, to conduct acts of sabotage, detonation of bombs, which end up killing civilians, because people did die in the Czech Republic. There were people who were injured in Bulgaria. 3 people were nearly assassinated with use of a chemical weapon or nerve agent. I don't know what else to call that. I suppose people who traffic in moral equivalency would say, well, look at what the CIA did in Latin America, so on and so forth. But, American policy has shifted in that regard as well, and we're talking about the present, not about the past. Look, there's a language of policy and diplomacy, and then I'm a journalist, so I can speak, I think, in more clear Orwellian terms. Orwellian in the sense of being direct, not, duplicitous or double-speaking.
Thank you. You want to react something?
I'm still contemplating whether I should say this. But since I'm only speaking for myself here today, I might do that.
Be careful with quotes.
I'm not going to quote anybody. So I think it's really interesting to have these debates that what counts as state terrorism, because we did have targeted liquidations and assassinations of individuals also done by different Western intelligence agencies, not only the CIA, but the French, for instance, as well. I guess the Stuxnet virus was not something that came out of the blue. And that resulted in an immense damage to the Iranian nuclear program, probably for us for the better. But the methods that we have been employing are a bit similar to what Russians have employing against us in the Czech Republic, in Bulgaria, and other places. Of course, if you look around, the West has a lesser amount of tolerance for innocent lives being lost in these actions. So most probably, if okay, I almost said it, I won't. So if the West wanted to assassinate a leader of a foreign country, they might not drop chemical weapons on them, because that would result in lots of unintended damage and collateral damage, which we have seen in Afghanistan, by the way, but that's not important at the moment. So in that sense, we might have different methods, which might be a bit more sophisticated, but the ultimate goal that, states are employing non-conventional measures to take out their enemies is clearly there. And whoever can use that is likely to use that.
It's funny. I mean, every Western, certainly American, former intelligence officer that I've interviewed would like for what you said to be the case in terms of taking the gloves off, as it were. But we'll very candidly tell you that the problem is the legal bound obstacles in place for doing exactly that. And I'm not, does the U.S. have a policy of taking out ISIS leaders and conducting JSOC operations in, sovereign? Yes, it does. But is that tantamount to, remember, the Czech ammunition depot was owned by the Ministry of Defense. So that's an act of war against another country with which you are not at war, conducted under the veil of plausible deniability, and the consequences were PNG and a few sanctions. And I'm not saying that the consequences should have necessarily been severer than that, but to my mind, and if you have examples of where the United States has done something like that, particularly with a country that we have normal diplomatic relations.
The Bin Laden raid, maybe?
What's that?
The Bin Laden raid in Pakistan?
As far as I'm concerned, I mean, Bin Laden living in basically a garrison town in Pakistan is a reflection of the fact that we probably shouldn't have such close relations with Pakistan. And also, I mean, this is a man who killed thousands of Americans in an unwanted terrorist attack on American soil.
But you have sent in, not you, but President Obama sent in the SEAL team to the territory of the sovereign country without officially notifying the Pakistani government. That
because if we had notified them, they would have probably notified Bin Laden.
But I know, I get it. Don't get me wrong, I get it, and I know it was necessary. But legally, I mean, having an act of war in a foreign country.
I grant you on the legal terminology or the legal sort of context. As I said, I mean, I'm speaking from a journalistic point of view, from a moral point of view. Some Czech guard at an MOD-run depot who loses his life because the GRUs come and decided to blow stuff up. To my mind, he is not the equivalent of Osama bin Laden.
I mean,
perhaps we disagree.
No, we don't disagree on that. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Let's just stop here because then all the conversation is being derailed.
Yeah, I'll ask my last question and then I open the floor for Q&A, and hopefully you will ask different questions and not continue this kind of dispute. But my last question connects to your comment at the beginning of our talks. You said something about Joe Biden's role. And my question goes to, what do you think, what leadership United States needs right now to react to the threat coming from Russia?
I mean, look, there are elements of Joe Biden's foreign policy I respect and agree with. Was he the flavor of the month for me to be president of the United States? No. I've found him sort of lackluster in most of his career. I preferred him to the incumbent, and I would prefer him again if the former incumbent should run again. But there's a real problem in the United States. There's a real problem in the United States with what I would call, it has nothing to do with left or right anymore. And it's not even driven by ideology. There is no consensus as to what is fact and what is fiction. There is no kind of unifying or rallying mission of the United States. All the metaphysical components, Ronald Reagan, Shining Hill, sort of terminology, all of this is cast by the wayside. There is such an air of cynicism, a level of hyper-skepticism that grades very seamlessly into gullibility. There's a reason why people who believe that satanic pedophiles run the United States government are now elected members of Congress, right? There's a reason that on the left you have, a hyper-overcorrection to cultural issues and to perceived marginalization of minority communities and so on and so forth. I'm very concerned because I don't see the social cohesion of the United States holding. In fact, quite comically so, tragicomically, when I was last in Kyiv a month ago, this was a capital city from which Russian tanks had only withdrawn 2 weeks before. And everyone from people waiters in the cafe to territorial defense members, some of whom were my former friends who worked in other industries such as media before the war, were full of bonhomie and high morale and good humor. And actually, one of them said to me at some point, Michael, are you going to be okay? Is America going to survive? And I came home from that war zone to turn on the television one night and see, one overpaid Hollywood actor slap the shit out of a stand-up comedian. And my first thought was, this is going to be 72 hours in which the American news cycle and the commentariat is talking about meaningless nonsense and taking its eye off of what has become the greatest crisis in Europe since World War II. This is what worries me about my country, the lack of attention span, the lack of prioritization, both on the left and the right. This is not a party political thing. I've voted for Republican politicians before. I voted for Democrats before. I have a fundamental worry about the sort of very nature of the United States at the moment.
Thank you. Would you like to comment on that? No. Oh, no disputes. Okay, so let's go with questions. We have time, like 50 minutes for some questions. Let's start with the gentleman there. We need the microphone, so because the event is recorded, so we make sure that the question is also on the
Why
video.
do you think the war in the Ukraine will be over next year in time for your book to be published? Because that's what you said at the beginning.
Oh, no, that was being glib. I don't know that it's necessarily going to be over in time for my book to be published, but I was given another year in which to finish my book, come hell or high water.
Okay, but do you visualize it as being a short war or a long war?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's folly to be in the business of making predictions, particularly with regard to war. I mean, again, coming back to how this was supposed to have gone as of February 24th, how many people were proven wrong? People who are much better versed in military affairs than I am. Do I think Ukraine has the capacity to win, or at least to make life as difficult for the Russian military and for Vladimir Putin as possible, such that he has to basically go home or scale down his objectives to such a degree that he has to dress defeat up as victory? Yes, I do think that's possible. Can I give you a sort of list of things that need to be achieved in order for that to happen? No, but a lot of this is just my own observation, my own impression. Having gone to Ukraine at least once or twice a year for the last 8 years, having seen the evolution of Ukrainian society. I mean, look, I was there in January to do one story, which is, why is it that Ukraine does not believe Russia is going to invade when the United States and the UK absolutely believe it, and it's the front page of the New York Times for successive weeks. And what I came away with was they were wrong, but for the right reason. They had such a level of self-confidence and such a sort of self-estimation as to think that he would be, meaning Putin, would be insane to do this, because this will be his graveyard. We will make life difficult. One MP in the Rada, a woman in Chanel suits, who'd never carried a gun before, said she was going to the rifle training camp to learn how to shoot, told me he will choke on this country. And also, by the way, Zelensky's popularity at that time was below 30%. Everybody across the board, including members of his own party, were telling me this is not going the way we planned. He's another corrupt politician, he's in bed with the oligarchs, and I heard everything. And lo and behold, Charlie Chaplin transformed into Winston Churchill within the space of a fortnight, simply by the fact that he didn't leave. And he he has very televisual presence and a charisma, but that stuff matters. You ask whither the West. We haven't got somebody like that. At least not somebody like that who I would claim espouses liberal democratic values as I know them. There is no charismatic politician that I find sort of dynamic enough and interesting enough to be compelled by. Again, for me, Joe Biden was simply a protest vote against the other guy. Now, that's not to say other people don't find certain politicians charismatic in that way, but I would like, frankly, I'm in a conservative forum, and I have no qualms with saying this. I would like to see another Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher on the Western stage. It's what we need. It can be center-right or center-left, too. So Zelensky, to some extent, espouses that. Unfortunately, he's too preoccupied in Ukraine to come and run for president in the United States, even though he'd probably win.
Thank you. The gentleman here in the front. Oh, we have so many questions. That's good.
Okay, yes. This is for Michael Weiss. My question to you is, what's the difference between Abraham Lincoln and Putin, given what they did? Abraham Lincoln preserved the Union. Basically, he said there's no secession. And Putin, who is in the midst of having the so-called former Soviet Union split up into I don't know how many segments. So there is history here. If you go back far enough, the United States didn't allow secession, whereas the Soviet Union allowed it.
Secession, the disintegration of empire and the self-determination of other republics, which became nation-states recognized as such by the United Nations and the international community. I mean, the short answer to your question is Abraham Lincoln didn't invade Canada.
No, they had
and try to annex territory.
He invaded these states that seceded. He did invade them.
Right, because he saw that as an illegal action.
He maintained the Union.
Look, if let us say, I mean,
By the way, he's a Republican.
there was a secessionist attempt by Chechen nationalists to basically leave Russian Federation territory, and you'll notice the Western reaction to certainly the first Chechen war, which wasn't as Islamized as the second, was not all that condemnatory. I mean, we weren't having a crisis of this scale. What are we talking about here? Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation. Russia conducted an annexation, basically an Anschluss in Crimea, kick-started a dirty war in Donbass, which it still claims it had nothing to do with, and now has, without the veil of plausible deniability, invaded a neighboring sovereign state under the pretext of what?
So is the South. They had their own government. They had their own president. Just to give you a history lesson.
Look, there are people today who want California to secede from the United States. Having lived in Los Angeles, on some days I'm not necessarily opposed to that endeavor, by the way. But I fail to see the equivalency here.
I would suggest continuing these disputes later after the event, and let's collect a few questions together. Let's start with this part, and then we'll go on for that part. We have three gentlemen here with questions. Yes, my gentleman, the column.
Hi, Gabriel Bram, Herzl Institute, University of Haifa. Herzl, by the way, who was born just across the river. Michael, if you haven't seen it, I recommend taking a look at Herzl's birthplace, but that's just, by the by, it's just over there. I'm wondering, does the American right have discernible goals that are affected at all by the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Specifically, for example, people like Jonah Goldberg have been saying the big losers here are the NatCons. Yoram Hazony and Rod Dreher better reconsider what they're talking about, because after all, Putin was Trump's friend, and Trump's Bibi's friend, and Bibi's friends with others who are interested in experiments in resisting mainstream liberal hegemony, standing up to transgenderism and LGBTQIA, and offering some conservative alternative that values family and religiosity. Are the NatCons in trouble here?
Let's go two more questions. There was a gentleman there.
My name is Pavlo. I'm just a simple Ukrainian guy. So, according to Márton Ugrósdy, talks that NATO doesn't have joint resolution, that NATO must help Ukraine. So, how much time for Ukrainians do we need to wait when NATO or Union alliances will come up with a decision to help? How many ammunition depots should be blown up by Russians in Czech Republic, maybe in Hungary, maybe in Germany, France? What's the level when NATO? What's the level of this, measurement? Then European partners, NATO partners will help and finally stand up for something which calls values, democracies, something like this. First question. Second question, what do you think? According that Michael Weiss said that Ukraine probably should join EU more than NATO. So what do you think Ukraine, according to my forecast, my personal forecast, is going to be frozen conflict? It's going to be Donbass second edition. Because even to rebuild villages and cities, what I seen last week, Ukraine doesn't have capability. We'll suck money from Europe, and it takes time. Build, first of all, takes time to demine and all this stuff. We know how much does it cost. So, as I see, it's gonna, take us for a long future. So, when we join European Union, will this, if we pretend we are in this union, if this union, joint government, European Union, will let us to go and take our land back, Maybe it's trap for us. Maybe we should stay independent because European Union will tell us straight to Ukraine, okay, guys, let's say you're gonna say goodbye to a land if you will join us, because any European countries will not Ukraine go for a war, for a next war in the future, and to take back our territories. What's the solution for us? Thank you.
Maybe one last question from, in this round, the last one from gentleman in the front.
Hi, my name is Theo Bash. To qualify myself, I was born in a communist country. I was in China in 1980 as one of the first American business people pushing business in China. I was in the Middle East to see the wars. A couple of things I'd like to say. First of all, there's a book by Mr. Viktor Suvorov called Aquarium for you. You read it, okay? And that's about the Giriu. It's amazing. I disagree on several points, so I have only one question, really major one. If Trump was president today, and let's not discuss about the big steal or anything, as a fact, one, will there be a war of Putin invading Ukraine? Two, do your statement saying that America is a declining power would be correct? The other thing about Russia is that it's very wrong to believe that the Russians will not rebuild better. Very naive, no insult intended. Out of this war, like other wars, Yom Kippur War and others, the Russians will realize they need to modernize their army, they need to modernize everything else, and I believe they will become a bigger threat than they are today. And the same thing applies for the Ukraine. Ukraine will become a bigger threat than they were before against the minorities. You guys don't know what they were doing to the minorities right before they were invaded. My specialty is biological warfare. Money was given by the Pentagon to the Biden family, specifically to Hunter Biden, to modernize the labs in the Ukraine. How much of that was stolen? Therefore, how much of Putin's reasons for invading Ukraine are maybe in any way justified, even though I don't accept the invasion, just to be clear. So number one, if Trump was president, would we be discussing the Ukraine war or the declining US power?
Maybe Michael, you could start, and then if you.
Some of these questions were encased in quite a lot of commentary, so I've forgotten. The gentleman up there, what did you ask again? Sorry, just briefly.
Jonah Goldberg says all this turns.
Oh, the national conservatives. Yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting. You know, you turn on Fox News and watch Tucker Carlson, who will amply comment on Hunter Biden and biolabs and why are we involved and this is going to risk World War III and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is one of the most watched, if not the most watched, primetime cable news shows. And yet, institutionally, most of the Republican Party still retains its prior sort of disposition with respect to Russia and international affairs. There's this rising vanguard of the QAnon caucus, Marjorie Greene Taylor, Elise Stefanik, and so on. But you know, at the senatorial level, I think you're hard pressed to find Republicans who don't think sanctions on Russia is a good idea. If anything, I've seen them criticize Biden for not going far enough. And interestingly, polling suggests that majority of GOP supporters support Ukraine. The problem is that at the generational level, and this cuts across both sides of the aisle, younger people, 18 to 25, either are indifferent or are suspicious or skeptical, which is essentially objectively being pro-Russia on this conflict. But I think, I am not an anatomist or somebody who's delved into sort of what galvanizes national conservatism. I know that Hungary has become a kind of lodestar. The CPAC conference was just here. And I think I have my own sort of theories as to why that is. But, is this going to be the death knell? I don't think so. I think Donald Trump is still firmly in control of the Republican Party. He's certainly a kingmaker with respect to those who are going to be winning primaries, or he can break a candidate or politician. I mean, look at what's happened to Adam Kinzinger. Look at what's happened to Liz Cheney. Sorry. When you have molded the party, it takes a long time to kind of have it unmolded, and there has yet to be somebody to rise to his level to sort of become the standard bearer. Now, whether that's going to be Ron DeSantis in the next election, who's seen as sort of Trump light or a smarter version of Trump, perhaps deceptively so, I don't know. Well, that was his question. Your question is different. You had a series of questions. You asked if Donald Trump were still in power, would this war happen? The answer is I don't know. And I think anyone who is... I disagree with that. Again, I don't presume to know. I don't presume to know what's going on inside Putin's head. I think anybody who tells you they know, including perhaps Vladimir Putin himself on certain days, is making it up. I'm inherently mistrustful of sort of, this is, X implies Y with respect to Russian calculations here. All we know is what has happened and what needs to happen going forward. Your question as to frozen conflict and...
Trap for Ukraine.
A trap for Ukraine?
Yes, if...
How will solve, EU will let us go and just be in the war, continue to...
Well, unfortunately, I don't actually... I advocate EU membership for Ukraine. I don't think it's going to get there, certainly not in the near term. Candidacy status, there are other things that can be done that are symbolically and at the policy level also significant. But look, I mean, I have one kind of overriding principle here, and I'm gratified to see that Biden at least put this in print when he wrote his op-ed in the New York Times last week, which is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. This idea that Western powers should connive to impose some kind of peace settlement or diplomatic resolution which involves ceding territory to Russia without the buy-in and consent of the Ukrainian people, however you want to measure that, in a referendum or elected leadership. There's a word for that when great powers, out of economic expediency or a sense of not wanting to be inconvenienced, impose their will on weaker powers. It's called imperialism. I don't believe in it, and I don't think the United States should be trafficking in it. And again, my concern is the longer this war continues, the more our attention will contract, the more people will be exhausted. Americans, at the beginning, they were electrified by this, dynamic, charismatic President Zelensky, the fact that Ukraine did not fall, the fact that tractors were pulling BMPs and Buk anti-aircraft systems. I mean, believe me, 24/7 for 3 months, I've been on every granular bit of this war. And I could see the American reaction to it. But you notice it's not in the news cycle as much. It's not 4-column spreads in the New York Times anymore. It's not on cable news as much. Now we have hearings into the insurrection attempt, 2 years ago. We've had mass shootings in the United States. Americans are, and rightly so, concerned with their own backyard. So I don't know if there's going to be the staying power here. I don't know if it would translate, for instance, if Donald Trump or a Republican were to win the next presidential election, would the institutional longevity of this maintain? I don't have an answer to that question.
Gentlemen, would like to comment on?
Because I'm Hungarian, coming from a small country, so probably I can feel your question, how deep it is. Why would you trust a great power? Why would you trust any great power? So, I mean, if this fits with their interests, they can support you, they can help you, but that's it. So that's the maximum the West would do. No one would die for Ukraine. That's the reality. So, and the domestic pressure of many Western countries also matters here. So they don't do it for Ukraine. They do it for their own political purposes, which is okay, which is acceptable. So it also shows to you quite well that something new strategy is badly needed for Ukraine. Yeah, that's my very short and frankly opinion on this.
Thank you. István Szabadföldi from the National University of Public Service, the military doctoral school. Last week we had a meeting with the Ukrainian military attaché, and I actually asked the same question. I would like to know your opinion. Regarding, I know that NATO is not involved officially and all of the stuff, but in a military action, politically, before it starts, there is a decision about defining the end state. Now, looking at the at the title of today's meeting, does the US have a discernible goals? What do you think? Is there a clear end state, envisaged end state of the Ukrainian crisis from the US perspective? And just let me have a very brief comment. Obviously, the Ukrainian military attaché as a diplomat, they have an end state, which is basically that they want to recapture all the lost territories of Ukraine. And my question towards him was that, okay, let's suppose that it will happen. Then you will actually get two major regions in the Ukrainian homeland, which would be filled with hostile population towards the central government. That was Crimea. That will be Crimea and the Donbas region. I mean, as my personal relationship and personal connections with Ukrainians, what I see, there are three categories. One of them is the Western Ukrainians, pro-Western, and really, I would say, well-defined Ukrainian ethnic identity. There is a relatively large population which is also mixed in terms of ethnic background, Russians or Ukrainian speaking, or maybe both, and they are actually supporting the always who is in control. And there is a third one, mainly on the Russian border, which basically don't want to belong to Ukraine, the central government. And I think that this is a very difficult issue now, as for the US and the West as well, how to take positions and how long does it will take and how many Ukrainian lives will be lost, in order to reach an end state which is not even defined. So what's your opinion?
So before I forget these two questions, I'll answer them. The first point, I know what the U.S. goal is, because as I alluded to earlier, Lloyd Austin articulated it. Now, whether that's, as they say, saying the quiet part out loud, I think it was very clearly the strategy, which is degrade the Russian military to such an extent that it cannot do this again in the near to midterm future. Now, what that looks like on the map, does it allow Russia to maintain parts of Donbass that it did not hold as of February 24? I don't know. Does it mean wearing down Russian manpower, firepower resources, waiting for sanctions to take a bite out of the Russian military-industrial complex, which, by the way, they will, because 90% of what Ukraine has shot out of the sky, whether it's drones or missiles or aircraft, both fixed-wing and rotary-wing, the guts, the electronics, are manufactured, guess where? In the United States or in EU territory. So these are dual-use systems, microprocessors that cannot be imported into Russia. It'll take a while for them to establish a black market for this stuff to replenish their military stocks. In terms of the Ukrainian disposition, look, the public brochure answer is all of our territory will be reclaimed. But, sotto voce, most Ukrainians, and especially the ones I talked to as of January 25, before the war when I was there, will tell you, look, you want to know the sort of inconvenient or awkward truth? Mr. Putin did us a favor by taking over Crimea and Donbass, because what he did was pen up all the fifth columnists who would otherwise pollute and erode Ukrainian integrity. For the first time in a long time, our political establishment is more or less united. They have opposition parties and they have blood-curdling feuds about policy and et cetera, but the idea of Ukrainian peoplehood and nationhood is solid. There's a block. Now, does that mean that the Ukrainians would be satisfied with the status quo prior to February 24th? I would venture to say they probably would make some kind of accommodation there. In other words, in the long term, yes, we want it all back, but for now, we're okay. Because we need to rebuild the shattered country, rebuild our economy, and we cannot do it without this political establishment where everybody is sort of united in the common cause. That's my hypothesis. But again, how it all ends, I refuse to make a prediction because I simply do not know. I would be not on my honor to tell you. I know how I'd like it to end, but I don't know that that's going to be the case.
And there was a question about the Middle East and the Taliban.
Oh, I think nation building went out the window a long time ago. In fact, Biden's entire position was that this war was at least 10 years, if not 15 years too long. We should have gone in, smashed Al-Qaeda, and gotten out. Richard Holbrooke, the biography written by George Packer, quotes Joe Biden saying something like, the United States should not be in the business of sending little girls to school in Central Asia, something to that effect. And he means it. This is his solemn belief. He's not interested in the Middle East other than to make sure that terrorist groups do not pose a threat to the United States. In terms of a strategic vision, no, I don't think there is, because I think there was a belief that the Afghan army could hang on at least a little bit longer, and politically it wouldn't be so much of an issue. The embarrassment of the withdrawal from Kabul stung badly, which I think also has been a factor in American resolve and commitment to the Ukrainian cause. They need a foreign policy win. But I can tell you, as of now, it seems Washington is using Qatar and Turkey as a back channel with the Taliban, hoping that the Taliban, at least because there are these internecine ideological feuds among jihadists or Islamists, the Taliban keeps ISIS in check in Afghanistan, and also make sure that it doesn't become a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. Now, I don't put high hopes on the Taliban doing either of those things, but again, Americans have a difficulty of being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Or when it comes to big foreign policy issues, this is not politically correct, but we're sort of like an idiot savant. We can learn to do one thing exceptionally well at the expense of knowing how to do basic things, in every other realm or capacity. So I think right now we're learning how to, do European security assistance and help Ukraine and outfox and counterman, Russian aggression. But all of a sudden now the war on terror has receded, and this idea of over-the-horizon attacks and all that, this is nonsense. It's not going to work. There will be a recrudescence of, certainly ISIS is down, but it's not out in Iraq and Syria. And you're seeing now Turkey opportunistically using the Ukraine crisis, using their veto of Finnish and Swedish accession to NATO to wage another campaign, quite probably in northern Syria, against the Kurds, which are our allies in the fight against ISIS. So there is going to be another Middle Eastern calamity. And I guarantee you, when it happens, everyone's going to scratch their heads and say, how did this happen? We were assured we had this all under control. Because remember, when ISIS came to the fore, everyone didn't even know what this terror organization was, even though the United States had been fighting it for the better part of 7 or 8 years in Iraq. It just changed its name.
Would you like to add something to it, and then we can
Depends
finish.
on how much time we got. Maybe 3 quick ones. First, on the NetCon movement that came from up there. I do tend to understand that why it's useful to taint the NetCon movement with the Russians. And I know that since 2016, Russia is responsible for all the calamities that have emerged in the Western democracies, at least if you look at the New York Times, which I recommend you against. But the point is that most of the things that we're seeing there are the genuine concerns that we have internally within the West. Outside of this political ecosystem, we might have something else like China, Russia, everything else, but I do not see such a close connection between the two. And we shouldn't let others define the NetCon movement from the outside by excluding us from the debate, saying that you're Putinist agents, therefore I'm not going to talk to you. That's not how we debate in the West, I would say. Questions on Ukraine, NATO, EU, and I'll stop there. I had my Facebook wall full with D-Day quotes recently. And of course, there was the quote from General Patton, who said that no poor bastard ever win a war dying for his country, but he win a war by having the other poor bastard die for his country. Unfortunately, the same applies to the Ukrainians, that NATO is very much interested in having the Ukrainians die for their country, rooting for you, but not doing that much, except for giving you weapons so you could last longer and lose more people. Never trust the great powers. They have their own interests. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Ukraine shouldn't be defending itself because it was attacked by a foreign country. It is the patriotic duty of everybody there to defend their country, because this is how the international system works. This is what people should do to protect their communities and their nations. And if there's one good thing in the war in Ukraine, is that finally, and I know the Ukrainian nation has existed for more than 1,000 years, but nobody can doubt it right now that the Ukrainian nation as such exists. And this is a defining moment for the country and will be for the upcoming 1,000 years at least. Unfortunately, it comes at a very brutal price. And the EU accession, I think, is more complicated because everybody tends to look at the money you get from the EU with structural funds, agricultural subsidies, and so forth. Nobody looks at the costs of EU accession. How much people you will be losing to the single market, how your local companies will be driven out by well-capitalized Western competition, what kind of rules you will have to take over which will hamper your economic growth, and so on and so forth. And to be very honest and brutally honest, and I tell this all my Ukrainian friends, that with DCFTA and the association agreement, you got 95% of the European Union. And we don't want that other 5%, which is out. I know this is politically completely incorrect to tell this from the EU side, but if you look at all the criticisms across the EU against Ukrainian accession, that is because of that. Nobody will say it out loud because it's impolite, but I think that's the basic reason, that we got all we wanted from Ukraine without paying the price for it. And if you look at what's happening to the Ukrainian refugees in Poland, as the Polish government is trying to integrate them into the Polish labor market by giving them social security numbers and enrolling them as de facto Polish citizens, I think that pretty much tells a story that how many of these people will actually go back, especially looking at the economic opportunities that will be facing Poland in the next 10 years, at the economic opportunities that Ukraine will be facing in the next 10 years. So I wouldn't be so... Of course, I'm not President Zelensky, fortunately, but I wouldn't be so enthusiastic about getting EU membership because there's also the cost side of that, which nobody talks about at the moment, but it's significant.
Thank you very much. On this not too positive note, I would like to close this panel, and I would like to thank our participants, Márton Ugrósdy, Michael Weiss, and Viktor Eszterhai for the talks today. Please give them a big applause.